Well, today we're here to talk about a subject that I love to talk about, and a subject that, frankly, I talk about a lot. I'm a university chaplain, and so in my work I do a lot of marriage preparation and get to be the witness at many marriages. And so today we're talking about the sacrament of holy matrimony. When I talk to couples at the wedding masses or wedding ceremony itself, at the time of the homily, very often I just turn to the couple and I say that I'm going to talk to you all primarily, and if anybody in the congregation kind of wants to listen in, they're welcome to do that. Because actually I noticed that a lot of times people listen to other people's conversations maybe more closely than ones that they're really invited to. So not just a joke, but so today I think I'm afraid I probably would be tempted to talk to you all in much the same way as talking to a couple who are just about to celebrate to exchange their consent in marriage, because that's where the homily comes in a wedding ceremony, is right before the exchange of the vows, and that's I may just get carried away, so I'm just warning you in advance. But so we look at the sacrament of holy matrimony, and this is based on a fact of creation that we see from the very beginning, that man and woman are made for each other, that God made man and woman in a sense really to complement and even to complete one another, that the two in marriage should no longer be two but be one. And this is a great mystery that God has put before us. We know that marriage was a part of God's plan from the very beginning. It's part of in the very beginning of Genesis, God institutes marriage. He looks at Adam and he says, "It is not good for man to be alone." And from his side, from the rib taken from the side of Adam, he fashions woman, Eve, and blesses their marriage, that the two become one. And so this institution of marriage goes back to the very beginning of creation as a human reality, and really the basis of all human relationship is founded in marriage. When Jesus came, he elevated this beautiful human reality to the level of a sacrament, which means that it is something that not only is essential to the flourishing of natural human life and society and family and all of this sort of thing, but it also is essential to the life of grace, to our sharing in the very life of God, and that's why it's become a sacrament. He has elevated this natural institution that goes all the way back to the very beginning, survived the fall of man, survived the flood of Noah, all of these things, and yet then is elevated by Christ to be a sacrament. And just what is the sign? We see that God instituted marriage on the natural level so that the two, man and woman, become one flesh. And on the supernatural level, marriage is to be a sign to us of the great love and unity that Christ has for his bride, the church, the love, that self-emptying love that Christ has for his bride, the church. That's from the 5th chapter of Ephesians. It's the only place in the New Testament actually where where the word for sacrament is actually used about one of the sacraments. And it's in the 5th chapter of Ephesians. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word. Even so, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. And St. Paul goes on to say that marriage is the great sign, the great mystery of the love of Christ for his bride, the church. And so we see how and why marriage has been instituted as a sacrament, to be this sacrament of unity, this sacrament that shows that it is possible for the two to be one, and that actually that's what God intended between man and woman from the very beginning. And that is a part of God's plan, a revelation of His love for us and the kind of unity that He desires with us. And so the sacrament of matrimony, it's very interesting. How does it come about? This is one of those questions that it's one of those kind of that you could stump somebody with. You ask, if I were conducting a course in the sacraments, one of the questions I would probably ask for each one of the sacraments, well, who is the minister of this sacrament? And when we get to the sacrament of marriage, I think I might be able to stump some of you all, because you might say, oh, the priest is the minister of the sacrament. That's not true. That's wrong. The ministers of the sacrament are the couple themselves, the husband and the wife, in their exchange of consents, of their mutual consent, of giving themselves away to the other, and the accepting of that gift from the other. They are actually the ministers of this sacrament. The priest is there as the church's official witness, who also has the great honor of blessing the marriage. It's one of the most beautiful things I love in wedding ceremonies, is what's called the nuptial blessing that goes through the whole sort of history, really, of this sacrament. But so marriage comes about when a husband and wife mutually administer this sacrament to one another, and in pledging and committing themselves to one another exclusively, indissolubly, permanently, for the rest of their lives. So marriage has to be brought up. We've said that they give themselves away. There has to be a free consent in marriage. In a Catholic wedding ceremony, some of you may have gone to weddings in other churches, and sometimes you'll see there's a line that's asked, the minister might ask, who gives this woman to be married? And if you go to a Catholic wedding, that doesn't happen. Nobody says something like that, because it's really essential to the Catholic understanding of the theology of marriage that the bride gives herself away, and the groom likewise gives himself away. And so there has to be this free consent. And so there has to be, so there are a lot of questions that in marriage preparation, it's one of the reasons why the Church says to be validly married within the Church, members of the Catholic Church need to go through preparation to be married in the Church. To, for example, really explore this idea of the freedom of their consent. Are you really doing this without any reservations, without any conditions, without any sort of, just that that it really is a gift that you're giving. You're making and that you're doing so freely without any sense of coercion or necessity. And so it is a free gift. It's also a lifelong and exclusive union. And so it's a gift that once it's made, it can't be taken back. But isn't that just really true of a gift? I mean, any gift that you could take back really wouldn't have been a gift in the first place now, would it? If a gift is given, it's just given. And there are no conditions, and and that's a very important thing about marriage. Marriage is indissoluble. Once a marriage has been validly entered into, it cannot be dissolved. And it's also exclusive. It has to be completely faithful. And also the third requirement for marriage is that the couple be open to children in their marriage. That this fruitfulness of their love, this sign really of the fruitfulness of love itself, must be present. So it's a necessity, a necessary intention in marriage. As a matter of fact, you cannot validly enter into marriage without an intention to be open to children in the marriage. I've mentioned that for marriage to be valid, the couple have to intend a union that is indissoluble. They cannot be dissolved or taken back. And so that really means, I just want to spell it out kind of clearly for you, that in a valid Christian marriage, divorce is not even a possibility, and certainly could never be any sort of, again, one of those conditions you might have in the back of your mind. Sometimes people think things, well, I really mean this to work out, but if things, if it doesn't, we could always get divorced. That would be an invalid marriage, because even the possibility of divorce is not something that can be compatible with this understanding of the gift of marriage. We have to realize that we see, though, that a very large percentage of marriages in our culture do not survive. It is a great, great tragedy. We hear people talking sometimes about in the church there's a vocation crisis in the church, and I would absolutely agree with that. And I think the greatest vocation crisis in the church has to do with the vocation to holy matrimony. Why is this the case? Why is there so much difficulty in people living out these commitments that they've made? What is it that threatens and undermines marriage? Well, it's the same thing that threatens and undermines any aspect of the Christian life, and it's the reality of sin. It is the fact that we live in a fallen and sinful world. And marriage, even though it survived the fall of man, it's definitely been affected by sin. And we've seen that. We see that in the lives of couples. It's one of the things I do on again, when I'm talking to a couple on the day of their wedding. I hate to be sort of a downer on that day a little bit, because everybody's usually so happy and everything's so beautiful. And I have to say to them, I said, but I hate to tell you this, but every single day of your marriage isn't going to be just like this. Unfortunately, there are going to be days when you all hurt or disappoint one another, or when there are other hardships that come into your marriage. But those things do not have to be things that undermine or destroy marriage. Are they difficult? They certainly are. But if we remember that in marriage, not only are the couple making a promise to one another, but the Lord Jesus Christ is making a promise to them. Sacraments confer grace. They confer this supernatural life to help us to live beyond what we would ever think that we would be able to do. And so that's what needs to be remembered on those days of hurt or disappointment or difficulty or frustration, is to remember the faithfulness of Jesus Christ as well to the marriage, and to say, Lord, I need that grace. I need to rely on that grace that you have promised. I need to be able to forgive, even though forgiveness is hard. I need to be able to say, I'm sorry, and ask for forgiveness when that is difficult to do. We both need to begin again after some difficulty. And so the church never teaches us that marriage is something that is easy, but it's certainly something that is very possible. To remain faithful to these promises and commitments is something that the grace of the sacrament of matrimony is given to a couple in order to be able to live out. I want to pause here for just a moment, considering this idea of vocation. There's a question that is everyone called to marriage? Well, obviously, no. I mean, there some people are called to the priesthood, like me, or into religious life. But there are also people who live can be called by God to live a very fruitful and giving life as in the single state as well. Now that has its own difficulties, and I don't want to make light of that at all. And yet some of the difficulties, some maybe even the loneliness of that state of life, is something that can, if it's used in the right way, unite us to Jesus Christ, who himself, of course, was celibate, in order to live a life that is very generous, very fruitful, and very full of love. Just to talk a little bit now about maybe some of the mechanics of getting married. Again, as someone who works with many couples, in preparing for marriage, I sometimes am really surprised at that some of the steps and the that are needed for marriage that the church asks of us, actually even sometimes requires of us, are really not very widely known. So I'd just like to talk about a few of those things right now. Marriage, as I said, is celebrated within the church ordinarily, and between two people who are Catholic. If one of the parties is not a Catholic, it is possible to get a permission for that. Those are usually fairly readily granted. But I always encourage couples not to take that too lightly, to really explore what that means. Sort of the conventional wisdom in marriage preparation is that the things that help to build the long-term stability of the relationship are the things that the couple have in common. And the things that are differences in the couple are the things that we really need to look at and prepare for and understand. And so sometimes, when couples are in love, it's easy to sort of maybe be tempted to say, oh, that's not really that much of a difference. And so I really do, though, encourage that those sort of differences are things that are really do need to be faced and really do need to be discussed, as well as just getting the permission or dispensation that might be required as well. It's also possible to marry someone who is not even a Christian, but again, the church takes that as a very even more serious matter to look at, and again, it requires a dispensation in order to do that. Again, I would encourage you, if the two are going to be one in marriage, as we said at the very beginning, that was God's intent about marriage for the very beginning of creation, that if that can be lived out in its fullness in each aspect of life, especially in these most fundamental ones, for example, in our relationship with God. That's not to say that a marriage in these other circumstances isn't possible, but that it does present unique difficulties. And I think that the church's sort of basic understanding of marriage, that it would be between a man and a woman who share their faith in common and are able to celebrate that faith, for example, in their wedding. One of the most beautiful and joyful things that I think I ever do as a priest is celebrating a nuptial mass, where a couple who are united in faith unite their lives together in the sacrament of matrimony, and then are united in Holy Communion and receiving the body and blood of Christ in Holy Communion. And I have to say that is the church's ideal about Christian marriage and preparing for Christian marriage. Again, also the idea, we've said this before, is that marriage would be indissoluble. But we've also mentioned that the reality of sin in the world and its effects even on the sacrament of matrimony, so that there are many people who are civilly divorced, although they were married in the church. I want you to understand that you are not free then to enter into the sacrament of matrimony if you have previously entered that. That's a sacrament that is celebrated for life. That gift is made and cannot be taken back. And so a person who has, even though they might be civilly divorced, is not free to enter in to the sacrament of matrimony. There are conditions, perhaps, about the consent in the first place of that first union, that maybe there were things that were lacking that should have been there, that we talked about. Maybe it was not the consent was not entirely free, or there was some sort of intention that's contrary to something essential about marriage, in which case it might be possible to explore that first union, a decree of nullity being granted about that. And so I just really, this is something that again, sometimes people, I don't think through any ill intention on their part, but just being formed by the world and conformed to the world's understanding of things, drift from the church's understanding and what God has revealed to us as the real understanding of marriage. That marriage is about this union. You know, Jesus was asked about divorce himself in his own time, and he said, well, you know, that was permitted because of the reality of sin, but it was not so in the beginning. And so the church always points us to the beginning, to understand what God intended for marriage from the very beginning of creation.